Thank you, Carol. I don't know, there are a lot of different thank yous to Carol. One, she is a force of nature, and if she asks you to do something, there's no opportunity to say no, which is one thing we love about her. Having written this book more than 10 years ago and spent 10 years in working on it, I did a few other things along the way because my full-time job is teaching. I'm really appreciative of the interest that there still is 10, 12 years later. Like everybody else who came out with the book in 2001, there was only one topic of interest, and that was Lower Manhattan, 9/11, and the effort to recover from what was a catastrophic event. So I didn't realize at the time that I would get involved in writing that story, but I have. Let me tell you just a few words about what attracted me to writing about 42nd Street and Times Square. First of all, I've always felt it was fascinating to study how cities get built and to write about how cities get built. So many people, I don't think the people in this audience for sure, walk through the built environment and urban space and don't really sort of look around and say, now, how did this come about? I mean, as somebody who teaches real estate, every time there's a book review of something I've written, what they say is she teaches real estate, whatever that is. And it sort of always sort of baffles me that people are unaware that somebody has to build, manage, and own the built environment we all enjoy. So my task has really been to find stories that I think will tell stories about projects that will tell a bigger story about how cities get built. And I'm interested in the plans and the politics, as Carol said, of implementation and the money equation, which is always in the back of everything, and the interplay, in particular, the interplay between public and private sectors. And I'm not sure there was a better example than Times Square, 42nd Street. I first became interested in this project in 1990, I believe it was, because of the very unusual financing arrangement to effectuate the large-scale cleanup of 42nd Street. And this was a relationship which I'm not going to talk about, but it's clear in chapter 4 of the book, in which the private sector was doing what the public sector normally did, as Robin Stout knows only too well, which was to finance the acquisition of parcels that were going to be condemned by eminent domain so that they could effectuate the transformation. As I got into the story, it clearly got a lot deeper than just the financing, and I ended up writing a book after, I think I spent about 5 years on sort of writing a report for the City Club of New York, and then I said, well, this is a lot bigger. And, my focus was on the full-scale treatment was the deep urban significance of this place worldwide. And I was very focused on the subtitle, Remaking the City Icon. And that was important because in 1990, nobody believed that cities would be where they are today. And it seemed to me that if you could revitalize Times Square for the middle class, not just the vast population that frequented 42nd Street and Times Square, that it was saying something about the health of cities and what would draw people back to cities. And so it was very clear in calling this Remaking the City Icon, because there was sort of no place else in the world that had this kind of cachet and this symbolic metaphor for what urban life, to see and to be seen, was all about. So it was, my belief that it could tell a larger story. At the time, there were a lot of unknowns, but I ought to say something about this picture. Both panoramas were taken by the same photographer. When he took this one, sometime in the 1980s, first of all, he had to patch it all together because there was no technology like there is now with panoramas, and he needed to hire an off-duty policeman to guard his equipment because he couldn't he couldn't put it down and take the picture and focus on. It was much easier at that point. He didn't need policemen, but he did, because I asked him to do the exact same thing. He did have to do it the old technology way, which is to patch it together. Next. When this project was started, there was no clear sense that it would succeed. It was risky. It was risky for a lot of reasons. Next. And I really want to pose 4 questions to give you some sense of it. It's hard to realize now, except that we're sort of all in a similar age in this audience. You might remember it was risky in part because they didn't know whether the ambitions of this plan would succeed, and I'll explain this in this chart, this map in a minute. Because when the city started this project in cooperation with the state, subsidiary of ESDC, what's now ESDC, but was then called the Urban Development Corporation, started it. The city, by the way, did not have the capacity to do this project on its own. The Public Development Corporation had just been formed, and so the city needed the state, and the combined powers of both were pretty powerful. But at the time this was started, there was real doubt whether New York City could do anything, could accomplish anything big. Westway, this was a post-Westway environment, and there was a lot of doubt that that anything as ambitious as this could be successful, because there were an enormous number of hurdles. But to give a sense of this map, you had 13 acres in the heart of Manhattan that was going to be condemned by eminent domain if you couldn't negotiate transactions. And the city had never used eminent domain for commercial redevelopment. They had done it for residential, they had done it for Lincoln Center, but they'd never done it for commercial because the feeling was the private sector ought to do it itself. So that was number one. That was a very big risk. And then they were asking the private sector to finance this, and the private sector would get paid back through a fairly complicated arrangement. So the black boxes are where they were going to put the office buildings. They were going to take 8.2 million square feet and shove half of it east, because that's where the value was. And then these mid-block theaters were going to be preserved as structures, if not use, and at least two had to be nonprofit. And the west side of the project was a little unclear. Ultimately, initially that was to be a merchandise mart, but the garment center landlords were really uncomfortable with having competition, so that fell by the wayside. This is now where the New York Times building is. And at the northwest part is where Ewalk is now. But this is a really ambitious plan, not just because of the scale, not just because of condemnation, but because the city and the state thought they could do it simultaneously all at once. New York has never done a large-scale project simultaneously all at once. They tried to, the similar thought was at World Trade Center, and that too, you just can't do this. No matter how much you try, there are a lot of obstacles in the way to do it all at once. Next. So the second real challenge here to whether this would succeed was the vision that the developer had for the cleanup. The developer at the time being George Klein of Park Tower Realty was, we're going to clean it up by making it corporate. This drove the Municipal Art Society and every civic organization with a sense of preservation crazy. And they weren't passive, as you know, in New York. Nobody gets terribly passive. Nobody stays passive about anything. And so they mounted a huge campaign. So the question was, could the civics defeat the developer's corporate vision and go against the power? Because the city and the most elected officials were not against this until the opposition arose. And I have a belief that opposition is not only part of the development process in a place like New York City, but it's actually essential, because opposition has a way of making the project better. It's a little messy and it's, it's contentious, but it does it make better. Next. So the third big question, okay, was, would the new urban design guidelines succeed? Now, these urban design guidelines came as a result of a compromise between the Municipal Art Society and the city planning. The Municipal Art Society said, we won't object to the project formally, as long as you, city planning, do a comprehensive overview of regulation and urban design in Times Square. Because what they were concerned about, rightly so, was the whole area, not just 42nd Street. They wanted to preserve the character of the area, the true cultural character of the area. They weren't against redevelopment. There weren't a lot of people who were totally against redevelopment. Everybody kind of understood this was a civic eyesore, needed to be cleaned up. But there was just different competing visions of what it should be. Next. So here you had a situation where planning was mandating commercial signage. Now, the history of planning and signage was to prohibit it. So here New York was sort of, as in many cases in zoning, was pioneering a new approach, because there was no way, you could trust. If you trusted private development to redevelop Times Square without mandating signage, there would have been no signage, okay? Or very tame corporate type signage. That would not have worked. This is the prototypical block that was used to design the regulations on how much you mandate signage, and they needed a special light meter that had to be designed because the regulations were not just about the 2D, they were about the vibrancy and the eclecticism and the light emitting, I don't have the right vocabulary for this, of the signage. Next. So the fourth question was, could the 42nd Street redevelopment project, the little 13 acres black, rejuvenate all of Times Square? The broader dark gray outline is the outline of the special midtown zoning, which went into effect in 1982 and sunset in 1987. And the 42 DP was supposed to catalyze the development of the whole area. Well, didn't work out that way. Both got revitalized, but it was just the reverse. But that was the idea. The policy idea was that if we just get 42nd Street going, the externalities that will be positive instead of negative will stimulate investment in the whole area. Next. So what I thought I would do, those are sort of the big questions. What I thought I would do, because this is not, I don't want to make this a terribly long talk as much as to entertain your questions, is sort of, pose the question of what's in Times Square today and give you a sense of what remains true to its character, what we might question is true to its character, and think about what it means in terms of its viability long term. First of all, I don't think anybody could have anticipated the level of rejuvenation that we see on 42nd Street in Times Square today. It's really striking. So next, one of the first things that's true to Times Square is the Times Tower, whatever its skin. This is the skeleton while it was being built. This is the Allied Chemicals, white marble redo. This is what Christo proposed, okay? You can wrap it all you want, but it's still going to be the Times Tower. I love that. And this is what it looks like with one of the big four towers behind it yesterday when we took pictures. Next. And you see the four office buildings. It's a little hard. There's one back there, there's one back there, one here, not in behind the New Amsterdam. So you had the four office buildings. The financing arrangement actually worked because Prudential came in as a partner with Park Tower, and they foot the bill for advancing the funds for condemnation, much to the surprise of everybody, because they did this in 1990 when the market was just flat, just had tanked. Nobody thought, and Prudential could have walked, okay? And nobody believed that they actually put down, oh, Robin, you're going to have to remind me, $240 million in a letter of credit, okay? That was a lot of money then. It was probably 3 times that, probably today, okay? Without Prudential's willingness to go out and do that, we would not be where we are today. Now, Prudential had this weird idea. Prudential thought that they could control the real estate market if they controlled all 4 corners. That was their real estate logic to doing this. It wasn't, altruistic public policy. It was the person who was heading real estate at Prudential believed that this was a commanding position to control this submarket. Half that logic is half right, but the New York real estate market is way too big for anybody to have any kind of even quasi-monopoly control over the market. Next. The bow tie. This is a really interesting story. One could write a whole essay on the bow tie. Okay, so the bow tie is a physical space that makes Times Square so distinctive. There are other places in the world, Piccadilly Circus and Ginza, that have great signage, but they don't have the bow tie. The bow tie has this, just fabulous physical space that makes view corridors that can't be reproduced. So, and it's always been a place where, it's where 7th crosses Broadway, where pedestrians cluster. So this first slide up here is from the RPA, the Regional Plan Association's second plan in 1968, where they were proposing a pedestrian makeover. Like everything is obliterated on the west side, okay? Then they have a much bigger plan to redevelop and stimulate West Midtown. Then comes, not that much, 6 years later or so, you have the Department of City Planning designing what I think of as a protective space in front of the Marriott Marquis, because the Marriott Marquis is the first new commercial investment in Times Square in decades, okay? So that's what this image is. These are all kind of protective approaches. Then you have, in 2001, after most of the project is built out, not all of it, there's one parcel that's not built out yet, you have pedestrian gridlock, such that they have to widen the sidewalk temporarily. That's what those white stripes are. In order, you can't even move then. You can't even move then. Yesterday, we could not move at all. And as my husband knows, I get really frustrated walking behind people who walk slow in New York, okay? So I was just going crazy. So then in 2009, they decide to recycle and redo the pedestrian ways because success has begotten just terrible congestion. And so the Bloomberg administration has a plan to redo everything, and that's sort of what happens. I mean, and you see what you see today is, I can't imagine what it would be like if you didn't rationalize, as we say, the transportation and the pedestrians. And, that's a really interesting thing, because right now what's happening in New York and in other places is that the auto is coming to be a secondary mode. Everything is now refocusing on the pedestrians. Robert Moses would turn over in his grave, but that's what's happening, and that's the shift that it represents. Next. This is my favorite slide. Okay? This is a New Yorker cover. One of the questions that I'll pose at the end is, does anybody from New York go to Times Square anymore? It is definitely the must-go place for tourists. And even when I looked at our slides from 2010, the crowd was quite different. There were many more, you could kind of tell a little bit by the way people dress, a lot more local people, and it's really changing. And even the New Yorker cover captured it. Next. One way that Times Square has not changed at all is that it's still a place for free speech, and free speech in its most fullest interpretation by the Supreme Court, okay? There's a naked cowboy. The New Yorker didn't, this says, because you're not naked and because you're not a cowboy, that's why, okay? All right. So these pictures, this is an old picture. This is 2010, okay? I can't remember what date that is. These are all yesterday. Okay, so we now have a cowgirl lady.
She's in her 60s.
Oh yeah, well, actually there are a whole cohort of them. And since they have no place to put the money they're given, there is a man who's collecting the money. I have no idea what the relationship is, but if it's what it could be, it's very much similar to what was there in the past. Okay? Okay, so you have all sorts of naked bodies that are at the edge of legality, which is a lot about what Times Square has historically been. Then you have the real free speech, Jesus says, Jesus save us, I repent, amen. And then we have the legalized marijuana. I mean, and we could have taken a lot more. Next. And it's a place of amusement. I'm not saying it, and also if I had more time for slides, I'd also say entertainment because there's sort of street entertainment as well. But I mean, it's like a circus out there. Okay, next. And it is definitely a place for crowds. This is one of my favorite historical pictures. It never came with a date, but I would imagine it's some major event because people still congregate in Times Square, even though we don't need to see the zipper to announcement to know what's going on. And this is one of the typical New Year's Eve events. Next. Also, what hasn't changed is this is the prototype sign building. That was the original one I showed in color before, and this is it yesterday. It's no need actually to replace the building because the building is a scaffold for signage. And that was that is one of the most, historical features of the commercial culture at Times Square. Initially, the signage developed in Times Square because it was prohibited everywhere else. It was prohibited on Fifth Avenue. The Fifth Avenue Association made sure of that. And so it flourished in Times Square. And I was pretty glad to see that at least we have one low-scale building left that is historically true to character. Next. Now, this is when I posed the question, could planning mandate signage? I asked the very simple question, how much signage was put in place for the buildings that were built right afterwards? This took 6 months and 2 research assistants to figure out, okay? Because it was quite, who was actually collecting the data? So what you see here is that these are the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 buildings that were built between 1987 and 1991. The minimum signage that was required was basically 75,000 square feet of signage. Of occupancy was basically 93,000 square feet, or 25% more. Well, that was a little eye-opening. Then if you ask which buildings were the big contributors, it was Morgan Stanley was a big one. The 2 Morgan Stanley buildings overbuilt by 50 and 60%. Now you have to remember that 1585 Broadway, which initially was designed for Morgan Stanley, but then Morgan Stanley pulled out only to buy it at a fire sale price. They pulled out because, reportedly, because they didn't want to put the signage in place. But they had, I don't know who the signage designer was, but they designed very clever fin signs so that it didn't obstruct the windows. And the question was, would the blue chip investment bankers at Morgan Stanley spend more time watching what was going on in Times Square or doing their work? But they went back. Next. These are just some examples of the vibrant signage that's in place today. These were all from yesterday. Next. Next. Oh, in case you want to watch it. Now, this is a place to see and be seen, and the density on the ground, I mean, is just incredible, much more so than earlier years. But I want you to pay particular attention to the right-hand side of the screen where you see Kodak, okay? Those are the Kodak, and the signs around it are signs covering the Marriott Marquis Hotel. Never a beautiful building, but it was significant for a couple of reasons. One, it was the first investment in Times Square in decades, and it actually took about 2 decades till it actually had enough viability to get done. And from a real estate deal-making perspective, it was one of the first, I think it was the second, deal in which the city extracted an equity kicker for an investment return for its incentives to see something like this get built. Next. So you see that big black sign, that big black board? It will eventually be lit up with, I don't know what, but that is Vornado's sign covering the entire front of the Marriott Marquis. It's massive. I don't know if, but you could see, flip back again. You could see how it changes the character of that space. I mean, it's unbelievably dramatic. I can guarantee you that nobody anticipated a sign of that size. Next. It's really big. Really big. Next. Okay. Some things don't change either. This is a 1978, around there, picture of Mr. Bones at the 100% corner, so what we'd say in real estate, 7th and 42nd. And this was yesterday. Homelessness takes sort of a different, now they have shopping carts, but they're still with us. And it's still Times Square. And the reason I put this up here is that Times Square is a particular place that draws everybody for every conceivable reason that one can think of. It is a special place. At times it can be a sad place, but it is a lot less sad today than it was many, many years ago. And next. So the question I pose and open for discussion is, what is Times Square today? I will say that Times Square has historically been a place of experimentation. It's historically been a place where the limits are tested. And if you read the cultural history of Times Square and the way people will generalize from it, there's a theme that goes, cities need a place where experimentation is permitted, where experimentation and testing the limits is necessary because we're a complex, diverse society. And especially in New York, stasis is not our mode of operation, okay? So, you know, what has the public intervention achieved? A tremendous amount, much more than anybody could have expected. And if a number of you were at the first panel that Carol organized, where the planners and architects who actually executed this were there, we were all amazed at what was achieved. It stimulated strong commercial investment, a vibrant mix of urban activity, rebuilding that was consistent with the symbolic legacy of the place. It did defeat the corporate image and whatever corporate style architecture. Much of it has been covered over, at least for the first 60 feet with signage. It is safe, and there, you know, I'm always hesitant to put security because Times Square is a terrorist target, and it will be so. But I also think that the security there, you know, we may have some of the security people dressed up as Mickey Mouse. You never know. But it is, you know, it's a place that has to be made secure. We preserve the theaters, and actually preserved on 42nd Street more than just 2 nonprofits. And it remains an iconic public gathering place. And all those things, and in addition, many more that are too detailed to list, are important. It is still brand central. Times Square was never a place for mom and pop stores. The real estate was always too expensive. So it remains consistent with its historic past. The signage is different. We have, you know, advertisers who weren't around, you know, even 10 years ago. As Tim Tompkins of the BID says, it's a small place of enormous consequence, and not just enormous consequence for New York City, but for the urbanists world round, and for other cities that try to emulate what was achieved here. The question I will throw out for discussion is, what are today's threats? There sort of always seems to be threats around the corner. You know, it's really a circus down there. You know, you have to sort of ask, can it get even more circus-like? And the reason the circus-like is a threat is that, will it drive at, will these two things, the circus-like atmosphere and the over-concentration of tourism, will it drive out the mixed uses that this, public policy finally attracted to the area? I mean, when you walk on the west side from 42nd to 43rd, you kind of wonder whether you look at this very corporate style entrance to the Reuters building and you sort of wonder who's going in there today, because it's so overwhelming. So that's what I would leave you with. A thought is that, what's going to happen the next few years? I believe that it's an incredibly vibrant place that represents a real success story for the city. I'd like to see it personally a little more balanced I'd like to see more New Yorkers coming back there, and I think that you don't want it to be, at least I personally don't want it to be a circus. But when people always ask me, what do I think of 42nd Street? I say, I think it's great because it's got done. I am not the critic of aesthetics. I leave that to the architectural historians and the architectural critics. What concerns me and what excites me is how cities get built and how public policy can effectuate change that the market is not ready to do on its own. So thank you very much. What do you want to do?
I know you want to have some dialogue and questions, but I did see Bruce Fowl come in at the last minute.
Oh,
where's Bruce? There he is.
Hi, Bruce.
So I figured Bruce Fowl, many of you know as an architect who anchored the corners of Times Square with 4 Times Square and the Reuters building, and then another one over on most recently on 42nd Street, but also with Renzo Piano of the New York Times building. So you've got a lock on Times Square, and you probably have some opinions as well.
Well, yes, I do.
You have to know, I wanted to ask you to kind of chat with me about this, and Carol said she was reserving you for another program.
Because we are going to have a last program on Times Square today and reflecting those views. So yeah, you're taking
Well, I think I have a couple comments relating to your threats, and I think several things happened that nobody anticipated. A number of things. One was we had to force the whole issue of putting signs on buildings. And if it wasn't for the mandates for so many square feet per building, it never would have happened because the developers hated it. There wasn't any real value in it. And you were blocking up windows for huge amounts of office space. On the 4 Times Square, the 44,000 square foot floor plates that had one whole side obscured by signs. But then, and then on the 42nd Street, there was a big difference in the guidelines, which were done after the guidelines, which were just sort of a blanket zoning for the bow tie. And the 42nd Street was more carefully articulated so that there was a sense of serendipity with the signage. There was sort of traditional Times Square sort of layering of signs. No 2 signs could line up, no 2 could be the same size. There had to be variety, which gave it much more of the old character. And if you go down 42nd Street, it's much better in terms of the variation and excitement of the street, and it's just a straight street. With the bow tie area, the city, the planning commission just came up with a blanket. The bottom 60 feet of street wall has to be 80% signage. Then you have to set back 20 feet, have another 60 feet high of signage, 80% of that. And they didn't anticipate, and that had to have it had to have a certain percentage of animation, and it had to have a certain level of illumination. And it didn't take long before the sign people figured that out and stretched, what do they call them, vinyl stretch signs which were just backlit flat signs, came into play, and so they got around the animation by putting the tracer lights around the edges of it. So that we're all looking very much the same. And now LED has come in. So it's really a very boring, very overpowering, continuous surface, so 2 layers of signage. And the architecture can totally obliterate. There used to be some beautiful buildings in Times Square. A lot of them are still there, but it's gotten lost. So you don't have any sense of richness of the history of the city once you're in that bow tie area. Much more so. It's better on 42nd Street for that.
Well, you know, your remarks are fascinating when you think about the historical signs at Times Square, which were mechanical. Smoke coming out and, you know, arms moving and, you know, dancing and that they were really fabulous. And, you know, I think you're right.
Spectaculars. You know, the Coke sign would have Coke pouring out of it and smoke coming out of the camel sign. And there was really tremendous depth and richness to it that really got lost.
So is that what you see as the major threat, Bruce?
Do I think that's a major threat? Well, I think it's just the lack of character. Yeah, somebody's going to come up with a better solution somewhere else, I suspect, and if the zoning ever changed with it. I don't think it's going to go away. It's just that it's a missed opportunity, in my opinion, to be what it could have been.
I think that's an important point. Other questions for myself or Bruce or Robin, who's here? How many other players are in this room?
Characterize Robin's
I
role.
have a question, and I think it relates to the condemnation process. And I just remember a particular Christmas Eve when all of the leases were being signed, and Rebecca Robertson was running the redevelopment authority, and it was something that, like, one of those things where there was a deadline of some type, probably from the financing, and all of these leases need to be in place for the 42nd Street the movie theaters, and there was some critical benchmark.
Yeah, well, there were two critical signings, this Rebecca, and they both happened on December 31st, close to midnight, if not in the afternoon. And the first was when the mayoral administration changed, because Rebecca felt that, you know, she and Gargano knew they had to get this done before a new administration came in. And then the second one was when the gubernatorial administration, the next year, when that turned over. And, you know, there really is a political risk to large-scale projects that take a long time to execute. And that is that they can be subject to to a change in administrations which doesn't believe in the agenda, okay? This happens less in New York, I think, than in other cities. I mean, in Chicago, a project may die. New York, it takes so long to get things done that it may get modified, but and elections in this city don't seem to be lost on opposition to development projects as they might in other cities like San Francisco, for example. But there's always the political risk that if you don't get those contracts signed, that if they're not, if it's not going to die, it could take another 6 months or 2 years, and you will lose the momentum. And one of the things you never want to do, and Rebecca will talk at length about this, is lose the momentum in a project. And one of the things that was so critical of 42nd Street was after Prudential put down the letter of credit to go forward with the condemnation, everything was post no bills. I mean, the whole street eventually within a period of time was all boarded up, okay? And there was no momentum. So Rebecca brought in, what was the name of that entity? Creative Time, to animate the place so that people would think something was happening. Because if you lose the momentum in a large-scale project, it's very hard to build. You could lose the political coalition, and it's hard to rebuild it. So that's why things, when you have a change in administration pending, that they will push to sign the contracts by midnight. Because at 12:01, it's done. It's done.
I will add that Rebecca was really extremely important for the whole process.
Oh, unbelievably important. She made it happen
Because she
at a
was
critical.
so consistent. She was driving everybody crazy, but she was so consistent and forcing everybody to do the same thing and trustworthy. And eventually everybody learned to really appreciate her and trust her, that yes, they were going to do what they're doing and that she was going to make everybody else do the same thing and it was all going to be successful.
And to your point, Bruce, about the difference in the signage, the urban design guidelines for 42nd Street, Rebecca's a planner and an urban designer. She knew this stuff. And, you know, it was her baby, that project.
Let me ask a variation on the question, because when you said about the skyscrapers and the towers and why they either, and because Bruce is here, why they either must look the way they looked in the 1990s, and maybe why they're not a postmodern, overscaled mansard mega tower that Philip Johnson and Johnson Berge designed in 1984. You said that government couldn't possibly, well, the market couldn't have absorbed 4 million square feet of space and 4 towers on 4 corners at one time. I think that's what you were
That's right, and it didn't.
Right, and you're right, it didn't. But there was a project of the mid-1980s that was built with 4 towers, all of the same design, and it's about a half a mile from here, the World Financial Center.
That was done at a different point in time. That was done in 1981, okay, which was the height of office demand from finance, insurance, and real estate, what they call the FIRE sector. So those projects went, the planning, the replanning of Battery Park City and the commitment of Olympia, New York to do that was at real peak of real estate demand. At 1981, actually O&Y was going to be a bidder on 42nd Street, but you know, they can't do, that wasn't going to happen. So in 1981, the city and the state are just getting their planning, you know, act together on 42nd Street. The plan goes through the Board of Estimate, that old entity we liked or didn't like, and didn't have to go through the Board of Estimate because the Urban Development Corporation had override powers on land use. But politically, as Herb Sturz talked about at the last panel, it did have to go through the Board of Estimate. But that doesn't go through the Board of Estimate until 1984. Okay, so by the time you really, and then you had 47 lawsuits. Robin painfully remembers 47 lawsuits, not including the New York Times headquarters building, so that by the time you had the judicial clearance, all that had been settled, it was 1990. The market was dead. And the first towers that get built in the next cycle are the 42nd Street towers because they were so competitively advantaged relative to any other development site in the city that nobody could possibly compete against that set of financial incentives.
Because of their jumbo size, because of
well, if you look at the FARs on those 4 sites, they range from about, I will get these numbers, I hope close to right, 26 to 42, 46. I mean, they're enormous FARs. Okay. Nothing like that since, you know, Lower Manhattan.
Well, I'm pushing you on this point because Bruce is right over there, so he can answer the question. And you took exception to a comment that I made in the first panel that the towers seem to me, in some senses, to be the implementation of the 80s urban design guidelines. But I agree with you on what I think you were saying to me before and in emails, and what Lynne is saying about the 4 towers had to be different, and you had the opportunity to make them different because the times have changed by the 1990s, which is what you're saying about the market. So my question is, are the your 1990s towers postmodern towers? Are they fundamentally different even than the Johnson Berge ones, even though they're the same size? Because government designed the floor plates, right? Government designed the massing of those buildings.
Well, 4 Times Square was the first one to really jump in, and that was the DERS. And the original FAR averaged about 35, as Lynne said.
That was a little lower.
And they had a height limit and a mandatory 35 FAR. So it basically was just an extrusion straight up. Very, very tough to deal with because very little, you have to have so much core. There's very little floor space, actually, for building of that size. And the DERS only were able to make it work because they own 11,000 square feet next to 32,000 square foot footprint that came with the package. So they actually approached, it was all very clandestine originally. We were asked to develop the scheme to show how they could make a building on that expanded site. They then went to Rebecca and went through the process and got the approval to do the building. And the only reason that building is articulated as it is because of the elevation site. Otherwise, it would have been, as Johnson Berge, would have been just straight up. And most of the other buildings are pretty much straight up. The architects were just doing everything they could to find some way of articulating the building. And most of it is two-dimensional, not three-dimensional. The Reuters building, we were able to get some more air rights on 43rd Street, which was a deal that was made with Cora Khan and the New Victory Theater. I think they owned the site behind it. I can't remember the details. So we were able to get more articulation there. We were able to curve the facade and set back a little bit. Differentiate the base from the tower, otherwise that wouldn't happen.
There's a piece of the story, though, when you say the city designed the floor plates and the densities are so high there because they had to finance the condemnation. And you see a very similar thing over at Hudson Yards, where the zoning is very much related to the financial strategy that the city needs. In the case of Hudson Yards, it's to finance the 7, but the densities were so high because they needed the private sector to pay the bill for condemnation.
Sure. And as the exhibition makes the point, and because we're the Skyscraper Museum, the skyscrapers were the deus ex machina to save
Yes, absolutely.
theaters.
Absolutely.
They were to throw off excess revenue that would be used.
Absolutely.
To fund the
Which is
theaters.
why the city was going to take the risk with the state of doing condemnation on commercial redevelopment. They wouldn't have done it any other place. I mean, they wouldn't do it just to do it. There had to be this very overpowering and overarching policy objective to clean up the area.
I think also to your point about Battery Park City, from what I understand, there was no anticipation that one developer would step up and do all of those buildings. It was a kind of surprising result.
That is correct. The RFP is the thinnest RFP because in 1980, when that RFP for Battery Park City went out, they didn't anticipate a master developer, and the city never had done public-private development like that before. So the RFP is like about 8 pages. It's really thin.
The financing for the bonds for the landfill was all coming due, so it was important to do the commercial early, and just, it was an absolute top of the market, and it produced, a whole bunch of at the same time projects, which would not have happened. It didn't happen anywhere else in Battery Park City.
And they were bankrupt.
It took Battery Park City 3 building waves ultimately to be built out.
That's typical. I think that's typical. I mean, they went back of having to do with Canary Wharf, not with Battery Park City. They used the money from Battery Park City to keep, sending over the pond.
Back in an earlier stage when they had the larger, more standardized buildings, I'd been to a presentation. I recall at that stage they were talking about a much larger rebuild of the subway station beneath.
Oh yes. You're absolutely right. Part of part of what we now call the public benefits package was that the developer of the Four Towers had an obligation that was somewhere ultimately on the order of about $95 million to redo the subway station. And the original plan, and there's a picture of it somewhere in my book, it was designed to be like Rockefeller Center, where you had big, huge plaza underneath, integrated with the subway, and internal access to the skyscrapers, for the towers from below. And when the financial feasibility of the project sort of collapsed in 1990, and the deal got recut, the developer's obligation for the subway went away. However, the person running real estate at the MTA was a woman by the name of Susan Fine, who's very, very smart at real estate. And she said she was not very happy that this obligation was going to go away. So she extracted a piece of the mortgage recording tax in exchange. And that piece of the mortgage recording tax has financed a piece of the Times Square subway renovation, and more, and more. Just as Carl Weisbrod made the point that the funds, the piece of the financial cash flow, the cash flow that the city got from 42nd Street project has financed the EDC for many, many years. So nobody seems to track this, but actually the city does get a return beyond higher property tax assessments when they negotiate the right kind of deal. Yeah. Robin.
I'll offer some observations on your threats.
Please do.
Things. One is that because there are, because of the success of the project in terms of the pedestrian counts, etc., the part of the design guidelines that Bruce was talking about and you've talked about are use guidelines, what could be the retail on the street. So there is every time a lease expires, there is really strong pressure from the developers to put in a run-of-the-mill retailer as opposed to something with an entertainment component. And the whole concept is that the street should remain an entertainment district, not 14th Street. So that's a pressure. Banks want to come in. There's enough, in my humble opinion, there's enough shoe stores already there. But you want to. The whole concept was to have entertainment-related uses as well. So that's one issue. And the other issue, which I think is really interesting, is that the Durst and Condé Nast obviously made a decision to come downtown. And that's terrific for downtown. But I call them now second-generation issues. The question is going to be, so who's going to come and take that huge amount of space in Times Square? Who are the office tower tenants, the commercial, really large footprint tenants who are going to come and remain interested in 42nd Street? It's an issue that I think will have to be addressed over the coming years. JP Morgan eventually moving out to the west side.
Yeah. I think it's a very difficult environment for businesses to operate in now. It is unbelievably overcrowded, and it's a good thing that they are rationalizing the public space there, because I think that will be a valve that will absorb, But, it's hard, it's just a difficult business environment. And so I think your point is very well taken, that for the next 5 years until 2019, that space is going to be paid for by the Port Authority, okay? Because that's part of the deal with Condé Nast to go down there. After that, it's a real it's a question. And between now and 2019, a lot can happen, especially, here.
Well, one of the things that the Times Square area has going for it that I don't think any other place in all of New York has is the accessibility. You have every single subway line other than the Lexington Avenue line. You have Grand Central Terminal, you have the Port Authority and Penn Station, all within the area. And I think those things are going to offer maybe a safety line to other large companies thinking of getting 4,000 people into 22 floors in a gigantic skyscraper. They might consider that as a plus.
The transportation is extraordinary, and it is still the busiest station. I was looking, I didn't know that the MTA publishes statistics on subway use by station, and Times Square is still, by quite a lot, exceeding Grand Central. But Grand Central is it's not an apples to apples comparison because Grand Central has commuter trains as well. But if I remember these statistics correctly, Times Square has something like 60 or 66 million subway riders for the year. I've forgotten the daily number, but you're right. I mean, it's an unparalleled, access point. People in Lower Manhattan are going to argue that they're going to.
It's a lot more convenient than one stop on the 7 line at the end of the 7
It's
line.
it's much more convenient, and I do think when you look at the map of Lower Manhattan and the MTA and the Port Authority's transportation hub, it has rationalized the lines. There are very long distances between, to make all those connections in the 11 subway lines, so.
Last question.
I was curious, how has your experience studying Times Square affected the way you're researching Lower Manhattan in terms of the questions you're asking people, or the way you're framing, the way you're thinking about it, or the willingness to be surprised about how things might change?
That's a good question, and I have thought about it. I think Times Square was a warm-up for me intellectually. I thought Times Square book was a hard book to write because it was pretty complicated, but it really only had 2, maybe 3 political actors and several private actors. The World Trade Center is of a totally different order. It's exponentially more complex, and the issues are the physical issues are complex. The legal issues are really complex because you have tremendous fragmentation of ownership and property rights, and on overlay on all this, you have an emotional situation that is for all of us living, we've never experienced before. Pearl Harbor was very far away for us, not for our parents, but it wasn't on the mainland also. And so the complexity at the legal, physical, and emotional and political levels are extraordinary. And so I sort of approached this. I mean, it was sort of the same story. I started writing a series of papers, and then I figured, well, this project is way bigger than that, so I have to write a book. And that was about 5 years or so ago. I'm now on my 145th interview. I do the same thing. It's interdisciplinary. I talk to as many people as I can. There's a basic set of facts, but more likely there are 146 different perspectives, and there'll be more. I try to learn as much as I can, speak to as many people as I can, go sit at my desk and try to make sense out of all of it, read an enormous amount of documents. Fortunately, I have a lot of people who trust me, and when I need to have information, they know I'll use it properly, and I have to go to various experts for things I don't feel I have confident factual information. I've been working on this one since 2003. I'm getting close to finishing. My husband back there is really hoping I am very close to finishing, and my whole staff at the Paul Milstein Center is really hoping I'm getting close to it. Same way, it's, I think I'm able, I bring to it a New Yorker's knowledge. This is not something that you can easily write if you don't understand the city gestalt. And it's fascinating. What can I say? I mean, maybe Carol will have me back in X number of years from now when we talk about that.
Well, but let me just say, apropos to this book and the in historical terms, the long durée of history. It really is time to reflect on the revised version or the new edited version of Times Square Roulette, because who would have known in 2001 or 2000 when you delivered the manuscript to MIT that that New York would undergo the
That's right.
cataclysmic trauma of the last 10 years or so, and then the phenomenal
From
recovery
the phenomenal
of the last
recovery.
4 years
Yeah.
or so. And if you put this book in a longer span of history, you started with 1900 or so in order to focus on Times Square, but you look in that trajectory of rise and fall and ascent and decline, the ascent of the moment in economic terms and is I think unparalleled, and the economic change is revisiting again the richest of the economic riches, but also the populist reception of the place, so that the crowds are as great or greater than they've ever been. So in the long term of history, Times Square has been reinvented. There have been so many Times
So many
Squares,
reinventions.
but in the short history of the 1980s to the present, it's undergone a complete reversal. And that's what merits, I think, the
Well, yeah, I
attention.
think I think that what's so characteristic of the city and the people who make it what it is, and it's reflected in Times Square, and it's reflected in Lower Manhattan and any other big project. This city has an incredible capacity to reinvent itself, and it does it best when times are bad, because then it really has to do something. And it's a very contentious, and there are lots of different viewpoints and lots of opposition. But in the long, span of history that you're asking me to comment about, the city reinvents itself. And that's why it is the city that it is. And we would not be a happy populace if it didn't do that. We're not, speaking very broadly in generalizations. So.
Well, I'll mention about this edition of the book is the Skyscraper Museum kind of cornered the market on the omnivorous resale. So we actually sell this at half price.
Which is very good.
We want to get the book because it's a classic. It's not an old book. It's a classic book. And we invite you to get one and have Lynne sign it.
People like me don't write books because we're going to make a lot of money. We write books so people understand how cities get built. And so thank you very much for listening so intently.
I'm Carol Willis. I'm the director of the museum and the curator for the exhibitions. If you are attracted here because you know Lynne's work, and I know that she has a lot of fans and students and everybody here to hear about the book, then you may not know about the regular book talk series that we run here, and there's a postcard at the front desk. Once a month, we have an author's talk on the subject of skyscrapers or New York City history or international urbanism. And this is the second of the fall, and the two others that are yet in November and December, I'll mention to you here. On November 19th, Judith Dupre in the big, tall book called Skyscrapers. It's about her third or fourth edition, and well over 100,000 books already sold in the series, which causes me to be green with envy. And then in December, Anthony Flint on a biography of Le Corbusier, who is, I suppose, enjoying a new renaissance of interests as we march through the modern masters and forget about them and then resurrect them in a regular cycle. It seems to be coming up on Corbusier. So I invite you to come back and to be regular followers of our series, and also I hope to be members of the Skyscraper Museum, because we're really dedicated to exploring all sorts of historical ideas, all sorts of subjects on the skyscraper, from the history to the future. And one of the great delights of being able to do 2 shows a year is to go back and forth between subjects that we want to investigate. And this particular show on Times Square 1984 offered the opportunity to take the recent past, and the subtitle of the exhibition is the postmodern moment, And I think you can see, well, we took down the Robert Venturi drawing that is usually right here on the wall, but that you can see in the various entries to the Times Tower site competition, the cacophony, the plurality, the pluralism, the multiplicity, heterogeneity of architectural discourse at this time. And this is very much mirrored in the politics of the moment, which was stakeholders from every direction fighting out the future of Times Square. And when this exhibition looks at a particular moment and tries to read the history of its immediate present in the 1980s and then also look forward to what happened today, and it's a show that we absolutely could not have done without Lynne Sagalyn's book, Times Square Roulette. Now, usually we have a brand new book being launched, but this one is a full decade, well, actually a full dozen years old. And of course, we're all going to encourage her tonight as she looks both back at the research for the book and recounts how she did that, but also compares what she sees as a New Yorker and saw last weekend when she was taking the new pictures of the signs of Times Square about the changes that happened between then and now. 2001, when the book was published, was of course the end of about a 10-year research period that she invested in Times Square that spanned years when nothing was happening, when everything was stalled, and Robin Stout, I see in the back here, knows full well about the lawsuits and the acquisitions of sites on 42nd Street. All the history of the 80s was one of grand ambitions, but an enormous amount of frustration and limbo in the site. And the various interests that focused their attention on Times Square, whether it was positive in terms of trying to rebuild and renew, or negative in terms of trying to foil and frustrate those efforts of the government, was all part of the picture, I think, of the conflicting motives that's circled around this place, which is so New York in so many ways. But for those of you who were not alive in the 1980s in order to have experienced Times Square, Lynne's going to tell us a little bit more about that, and the exhibition tries to evoke those days. But it's very interesting to look from this moment in 2014 back 30 years and to see the complete 180-degree turnaround of the place between then and now. And it's an interesting assignment to describe what Times Square is today and whether in essence it bears any relationship, as the Landmarks Commission and as the Department of City Planning endeavored to ingrain in the future of Times Square, which we're now all experiencing, that sense of place which it wanted to protect. And apropos of that, I need to promote our November 11th program, which you can take a flyer on at the front desk, which is called Senses of Place, Reflections on Preservation in Times Square. And on that day, up at Columbia University, where we'll present the program in conjunction with the Historic Preservation Department, we have 5 experts who were soldiers in the fields of the preservation battles back in those days. So this program tonight, Lynne's talk, is really the second of a series that is exploring many dimensions of Times Square's history. But there's nobody who can who can unpack this period and this place better than Lynne Sagalyn, who is a professor of real estate at the Columbia School of Business. She has a very long title, which I won't go into, but she is someone who has always been interested in planning and politics, and in interviewing the actual participants who are actors in the playing out of the planning and the realization of the changing urbanism in places like Times Square. And her when I say recent, I'm referring to a recent decade's worth of research on the World Trade Center will be the next book that follows the same research strategies. Here is Lynne Sagalyn.
Thank you, Carol. Carol, do you want to?